Okay, thank you everyone for coming. This talk is about the art of instructional writing. And before we get into that, just a quick introduction. As well as running You Got This, by day, I'm Director of Developer Relations at an open source data platform called Directus. I've authored over 100 pieces of tutorial content and a lot of documentation. And as part of my job, I also review over 100 pieces of instructional writing per year, which is why I thought this would be an interesting talk to put together. So let's talk a bit about what instructional writing even is. Writing is obviously the if not one of the most prominent ways in which we communicate with others, whether that's chatting with friends, whether that's keeping a record of events, or whether that's to entertain or express ideas. Now, instructional or educational writing is all about instructing, informing, or imparting knowledge to the reader. And as part of my job, that can mean writing tutorials on how to achieve a goal with code. It could be explaining a concept or writing reference material. Now, even within the realm of authoring technical content and documentation, there's a lot of different kinds of content. Now, this little grid here is from the Diataxis framework. You can look at their website. We're going to talk a bit about this for a few minutes. You can, as I said, read more on their website. It's quite thorough. The Diataxis framework provides a way to think about these different content types and how they relate to the users, to the readers' needs. This framework helps understand the rationale why we write content, the content itself, like what do we write on the page, the style, how to write it, and the architecture, how to organize it. Now, each of these areas correspond to the way that people actually do become expert in a given topic. So quite often, it's not always the case, but quite often a learning journey will be fairly linear, starting with the learning-oriented phase in the top left. We begin by learning. We learn a skill by doing, so hopefully with some support from someone who knows the skill. Then once we kind of have built something, we kind of have a feel for it, then we put that skill to work in a more practical way for our day-to-day. Then, or not then, also, when we do not have the skills or knowledge we require to fulfill a task, we may go ahead and read a more thorough reference manual to understand the inner workings, the machinery behind the systems that we're using. And then, given all of this knowledge, all of this experience, having in-depth explanations then helps solidify and lock in that logic. And then perhaps it's back to the start. Perhaps there is a new topic to grasp, or we want to go deeper. Now, this isn't really a talk about diataxis, but instead I'm urging you to start your instructional writing practice by understanding why someone's even going to read this in the first place, and use that as the basis for the decisions that we're going to talk about coming up. Now, as part of my current role, I get to review dozens of pieces of writing from technical authors with varying experience. And as well as wanting them to obviously document and share the skills they have, I also aim to turn people into better authors through a thorough but kind review process. Now, in the rest of this talk, we're going to walk through these kind of top tips that I apply to every technical content review that I deliver. And the first thing to understand is who you are writing for. And typically in technical writing, this relates not only to the reader's goal, but also their skills. Now, in terms of goal, this can inform how you present your tools and techniques that feature in your writing. For example, if your post is aimed at a developer who's trying to implement the knowledge that you are sharing, then you don't need to spend time convincing them that your tool or your approach is best. However, if the post is aimed at someone perhaps evaluating your technology or technique, then you may choose to employ more persuasion techniques. You have to be incredibly clear with everyone involved in creating and signing off content what the purpose of a piece is, and rarely does it work to try and do both. Now, in terms of skills, This often manifests in a prerequisites or a before you start section in technical writing. This talks about the tools and the skills that the reader will need, explicitly or explicitly kind of calling out who is this for in like an introduction section. This is an example from a project-based tutorial piece that I reviewed last month. This section was right at the top of the post, just below the introduction, but before we got into the kind of instructional part. It explicitly states you will need Node.js and a code editor installed on your computer. You will need a director's project, and you will need knowledge of Vue.js and the composition API. As a result, this post frames itself as for Vue.js developers. It also removes the need to explain the composition API or how to set up a director's project. And in this case, there's even a link out for that. There is a chance that the reader does not already have this prerequisite set up. Many writers have the tendency to explain their writing in a level of detail that anyone can follow from beginning to end without ever leaving the post. But this can make for a really long piece of writing full of potentially irrelevant details, especially if you've already framed who this is for. If you framed that the reader must have some knowledge of Vue and have some knowledge of the composition API, then why are you explaining it? You've said that's a prerequisite. And if someone already has those things, then you are making the post unnecessarily long. There is absolutely no shame in saying you need XYZ skills before following this piece of writing. Just set the expectations and follow through on those expectations. Next is consistency. And consistency is a key part of technical content reviews that I give, but they are important for any piece of writing, really. Now, if you're writing on behalf of an organization or someone else, you could really stand to learn what their tone of voice is and then try and adopt it for your writing. A tone of voice describes how you speak, the choice of words you use, how you explain things, the values that you embody. This is a bit of a hard one to explain, so let me give you a quick example. I reviewed a post which was about getting started with a specific web framework and directors. In explaining why the framework was great, the author also made jokes about other frameworks not being good, and this just did not match our tone of voice. Not only are we not negative towards people's technology choices, but also we're unopinionated. So I asked them to not only remove the critique of other frameworks, but also the praise of the one that they're writing about. It's also fair to say in this context, the reader is almost certainly already using that framework, so we don't need to sell them on it. They're just learning about how to implement this technology and that framework. The tone of voice can also change between different instructional writing content types. There may be some character and personality and jokes even in tutorials, but none whatsoever in reference material. Next, we're going to talk about pronouns. And I'm not talking about gender here, but instead person. So first person is when you use words like I or mine in singular and we or ours in plural. Second person is you or yours. And third person is rarely used in instructional writing, but it's the he, she, they, it perspective. It's when you're speaking about a subject who is not you or the reader, that instead they are the third person. Now, keeping consistent pronouns is something I look for in every review. In technical content, I don't mind if writers use first person plural. So we or ours, we're going to build this, go to our folder. Or second person, go to this folder on your computer, open this file, and so on. Now, there is one exception, which we'll talk about in a minute, but for most instructional writing, I personally prefer second person pronouns throughout, as it centers the reader in the narrative. Finally is consistent terminology. So if you call something a database row, call it that throughout. Don't swap to calling it a record. If you stylize some text with a capitalized first letter, keep it consistent. If you hyphenate a term and you use it in the same way, continue to hyphenate it. Now, going back to pronouns, let's talk about that exception for a moment. So in this example post here, we have the following. We will have the following when I make it big enough to read here. I have always loved social deception board games, and I recently took my favorite game and created a mobile application so I could play it with my friends. In this tutorial, I will show you how to build it for yourself. This is the introduction, it's the context, it's in first person singular. Now we move into the instruction. Initialize Nux application. Open your terminal and run the following command. We have now shifted into the second person pronoun. So this is quite valid as long as once you enter the instructional phase that you keep it consistent. And often for instructional writing, using first person singular throughout doesn't feel quite right. You can also kind of change the pronoun again if you get to the very end of a post, kind of the bookend. You can move that to second person plural, second person if you're not already using it. So we, let me start that again. Oh, I'm tripping up on my words. You can use first person plural, we, ours. So for example, in this context, I did something in the past. I built this game. Now I'm going to show you, the reader, how to do it. Here's all the steps on how to do it. Now at the end, we have built a thing. So you can shift back to first person plural. So here's just an example, but once again, it's really important that at least in that instructional section that you are staying consistent throughout. The next tip is simply to write less. Every word counts. Attention and energy is a finite resource in this world, and you should respect your reader. And if anything, the ability to impart knowledge concisely is a valuable skill in itself. Now, writing less takes two forms. Firstly, simply removing words. Here are two sentences that mean exactly the same thing. The first one reads, next, you must open your code editor and navigate to the index.js file. Scroll below the main function and paste the following code in. Or you could say, in index.js, add the following code under the main function. Exactly the same meaning. One is incredibly direct, incredibly instructional, incredibly to the point, and half the length. This should be something you're seeking to do in your instructional writing. Now, the other way we can write less is by removing repetition. Now, in this example here, this is a real example from a post I reviewed last week. There are two types of repetition I want to talk about. Firstly, the post is called Migrating from WordPress to Directors, and the before you start section is incredibly short. All it says is, to follow along with this guide, you will need a WordPress website and a Directors project. That's it. That's all you need. Well, obviously, the post is called Migrating from WordPress to Directors. And in fact, by the time you are migrating, you have both of the, or even considering migrating, you have both of these things. So that's pretty obvious. That whole section before you start went away. Now, of course, if there was more context required, we needed more things, then the whole section doesn't need to go. We can just make it less repetitive. The second kind of repetition is quite common with writers, and it's actually introducing sections underneath their subheadings. So here we have another example. A subheading reads, Understanding the Differences. Before going into the migration, let's try and understand some major differences between WordPress and Directors. WordPress is da-da-da. That last bit's fine, but the heading is called Understanding the Differences. Of course, in this section, we're going to understand the major differences. That's what the header says. A lot of writers, again, have that tendency to just repeat the heading in prose. You don't need to do that. People read the headings. Next, we'll talk about structuring the writing in a way that makes sense. And this is a structure that maybe I've developed, or I use, I suppose, if I stole it at some point, in order to this is a structure I use for my technical writing. And this works for both the overall post, but also individual sections. Firstly, we start with the goal. Tell the user what's going to happen by the end of this section. What are you going to do? What are you trying to build? What will it look like? What will it achieve? This not only proves as great motivation to get someone to the end of the section, but it also ensures your reader the outcome is what they expect it to be. And if it isn't, they know that before they sink time with you, and they can bounce if it isn't for them. Next, orientation. Where should the user be? What should things look like? What file should I have open? And so on. Next, all of the boring and required setup, all of the boilerplate, and we do it all at once, all at the beginning of a section, so we don't need to bother with it again. Next is the actual thing that we're here to write, the actual instruction itself. What are you teaching? The actual steps. And then finally, validation. Does it work? What might some common failures look like? Now, let's take this to an example. So, a user must be able to register for a new account. Okay, that's the goal. Right, by the end of this section, let's do that. Sure. In your pages directory, create a register.view file. Okay, we've oriented the user. We've told them what directory they should be in. We've asked them to create a file. They now have the file open. Create all the form, do all the data binding, do all of the events, do all of the validation, do the boring stuff, right? Do all of that setup up front, get it out of the way so we can focus on the actual thing we're trying to teach. Create a register method, use the SDK, here are code examples, here are explainers, and so on. That's what we're really here to teach, but we require the bits above in order to contextualize what we are achieving. And then finally, validation. Test it by doing something. You should see something happening. And if not, try this, check this, so on and so forth. Like, here are some common troubleshooting steps. My final tip is focus. Focus on the goal of your reader and nothing else. I've read so many blog posts where half of the code snippets are just CSS styling and the post is nothing to do with CSS or styling. I don't care about it. It's opinionated. I'm going to change that anyway, and it's getting in the way and it's making this take longer than it needs to. It's distracting. Your reader may not need all of a form explained when the topic is only about validation. Your reader may not want to look at all of the fancy pre-processed style sheets when it's just a little CSS tip. You know, whenever you bring in an opinionated text outside of the scope of the focus of your post, you're wasting that reader's energy. And at worst, readers won't be able to work out what is the actual point I'm trying to, what is the core learning, what code do I need to apply this, this topic to my own project. And then they may not realize, and that sucks. You're going to end up giving people code that they don't need. The ability to look at a full set of code and go, that's the important bit, I'm just going to take that, is a skill we develop, not a skill we intrinsically have. And just a final reminder on focus. On average, every 600 words read is 5 minutes of reading time. And of course, this slows down with code. People often pause, they understand the code, they look at it, they inspect it, or they're simply playing along. So be really cognizant of every word you write, and all of the topics you introduce, and keep posts, if you can, scoped really tightly. So that's a little bit around instructional writing. This talk will be made available afterwards. I'm also writing a blog post with the same content if you prefer reading it. But thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have at all, really.